They just authorized the seizure. Not with police, not with tanks, not with a dramatic raid you can live stream. They authorized it with a checkbox, a rating, a compliance code, and a deadline that turns your property into their leverage. And if that sounds like exaggeration, here's the cold part. You don't even have to break a law to lose control. You just have to fail a standard that keeps moving. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you the machine, how it works, why it's already built, and why the green label is the cleanest camouflage a transfer system has ever had. Welcome back. Let's get into it. Here's the trick modern systems learned a long time ago. If they kick your door in, you resist. If they freeze your account overnight, you riot. If they announce a straight-up confiscation, they lose legitimacy. So they don't do it like that. They do it like this. They change the definition of ownership without ever using the word ownership. They don't say, you don't own this anymore. They say, you can keep it if your home meets this rating, if your car meets this class, if your business reports this disclosure, if your savings sits in this approved box. And that if is where the seizure lives. Because if means conditional. Conditional means revocable. Revocable means controllable. This is not a future theory. In a lot of places, the infrastructure is already sitting there, waiting. Property registries, tax systems, insurance rules, lending standards, utility databases, licensing authorities, compliance audits. All it needs is one thing, integration. Because once the databases talk to each other, enforcement becomes automatic. No soldier required. Just a system that quietly says non-compliant assets get punished until they become unaffordable, and then they get transferred. That's the whole game. Now, before you dismiss this as doom content, you need to understand one financial law that never breaks. When a system promises more than it can deliver, it doesn't apologize. It reassigns. It shifts the burden. It rewrites the rulebook. And the rewrite always hits the same people first. The visible, the registered, the trackable, the ones who can't move fast. That's you. That's the middle. That's the people who think I followed the rules is a shield. It isn't. It's a target. So let's break down the machine. Not with slogans, with mechanics. This transfer machine has 4 stages. Stage 1, the impossible promise. Stage 2, the delay tactic. Stage 3, the confidence crack. Stage 4, the ownership rewrite. Different countries, different decades, same pattern. And once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. Stage 1 is always the same. A promise that exceeds real capacity. Not just, we'll try. A mandate, a guarantee. A political oath that can't be funded without pain. Stage 2 is the same. Stretch reality, borrow. Print, subsidize, leverage, hide it in accounting, kick the bill down the road. Stage 3 is the same. Reality bites, inflation, rate shocks, bank stress, liquidity freezes, energy spikes. Something exposes the gap between paper promises and physical output. And then stage 4 arrives, not with a headline, with a form, a regulation, a classification system, a new definition of what counts as acceptable. And that's where the transfer happens. So let me give you 3 blueprints, not rumors, not hypotheticals, blueprints of how stage 4 gets executed when a system is cornered. First blueprint, Weimar Germany. After World War I, Germany gets hit with external demands tied to national output, not a normal debt you refinance, a political extraction. And the government has a problem, raise taxes too hard and you get revolt. So it does the easiest thing, it dilutes, it prints. And when printing becomes policy, the currency doesn't weaken, it disintegrates. The speed is the point. Because fast inflation doesn't just raise prices, it destroys memory, it wipes out savings, it deletes the careful people. And that's the real confiscation. You don't have to take someone's money if you can erase its purchasing power. Now here's the part most people skip. The solution that follows is not just stabilization, it's restructuring. A new system gets introduced, and to restore trust, it anchors itself not to good intentions, but to claims on real assets, land, productive capacity, industrial value. Translation: when paper collapses, the rescue gets built on the tangible world. And when the rescue gets built, the claim structure changes. Who has first claim? Who gets protected? Who gets sacrificed? It's stage 4 with a stamp. The system survives by reorganizing claims on reality. Second blueprint, the United States during the Great Depression. Banks failing, people desperate, confidence evaporating. And what do humans do in a panic? They run toward the thing they trust. Back then that meant gold. Gold is the opposite of a promise. It's not a liability. It's outside the bank. It's portable. It can't be printed. And in a crisis, gold becomes a referendum on the system. So what happens when too many people choose the asset that competes with the government's monetary control? The system doesn't compete fairly. It removes the competition. Restrictions, centralization, forced exchange into paper, And then, after the metal is pulled in, the rules shift. Whatever you think about the ethics, the mechanism is clear. When survival is on the line, systems will criminalize escape hatches. Not because you're evil, because your exit breaks their math. That is stage 4. The safest move becomes restricted because it threatens the structure. Third blueprint, Cyprus, modern, administrative, no dramatic speech is needed, banks stuffed with bad assets, a bailout negotiation, and then a solution that tells depositors, you will pay, not through a tax vote, through a resolution framework. Funds frozen, portions converted, losses pushed onto account holders. And notice the language, not seizure, not theft, recapitalization, stability, necessary measures. This is the new model, clean, bureaucratic, legal, done through policy plumbing. No soldiers, no chaos, just an updated account statement that reads like your money moved because it did. That's 3 eras, 3 banners, same machine, promises outgrow capacity, reality breaks, then ownership rules get rewritten to plug the hole. Now, take that lens and look at today. Stage 1 is everywhere. Global liabilities have swollen for decades. Public debt, corporate debt, household debt, stacked on top of each other like a tower that requires low rates and high confidence to stand. At the same time, another promise is layered on top. Rapid transformation, electrification, retrofits, grid upgrades, industrial retooling, transport overhaul. Whether you love it or hate it doesn't change the balance sheet fact. It's expensive. It's time-bound. And it's being framed as non-negotiable. That is stage 1, a mission bigger than productive slack. Stage 2 is what we just lived through, a world that tried to smooth shocks with massive spending, credit expansion, and monetary support. And then inflation shows up. And people misunderstand inflation. Inflation isn't just prices are annoying. Inflation is the system admitting, without saying it, that the promises exceeded the goods. Inflation is the silent tax that arrives when the math doesn't work, but nobody can politically admit default. So instead of a clean default, you get dilution. And when inflation flares, the next thing happens. Rates rise, credit tightens, and the fragile parts start cracking. That's stage 3, not always a single crash, sometimes a rolling squeeze. Higher mortgages, more expensive business loans, volatile energy bills, insurance repricing, regulatory complexity growing like mold. Now put the green mandate on top of that squeeze, and stage 4 starts taking shape. Because this is where the modern version gets genius and dangerous. Modern confiscation, it doesn't look like a man grabbing your keys. It looks like your asset becoming non-compliant. And once it's non-compliant, it becomes illiquid. And once it's illiquid, it becomes cheap. And once it's cheap, someone else buys it. That's the transfer. And it's not one event, it's a pipeline. Here's the pipeline. Step 1, redefine what counts as a good asset. A clean home, a safe vehicle, a responsible business, a sustainable investment. These labels sound moral, that's not an accident. Because moral labels make resistance socially expensive. If you complain, you're not protecting your property. You're against progress, you're selfish, you're denying something urgent. Perfect. Now step 2, attach penalties to the bad assets. Not always a ban, sometimes it's a fee, a fine, a special tax rate, a mandatory inspection, a forced upgrade, a higher insurance premium, a lending restriction, a resale limitation, a utility surcharge. Individually, each penalty looks small. Together, they form a vice. Step 3, synchronize enforcement across the systems that touch your life. This is the part that makes it irreversible. Land registries, tax authorities, banks, insurers, utilities, licensing agencies, compliance databases. Once those are connected, the machine runs by itself. You miss a compliance threshold, your insurance changes, your mortgage terms shift, your resale pool shrinks, your taxes rise, you get flagged, you get audited. And then you get a letter with a deadline. And that's how it feels from the inside, not like a seizure, like a slow suffocation. You receive a notice, then you get a timeline, then an inspector shows up, then a rating appears on your property record, then a penalty starts, then the penalty escalates, then your insurer reprices, then your lender tightens, then your buyer options disappear, then you're forced into a decision you didn't choose. Sell under pressure, take on debt at bad terms, or fall into default. And once you default, transfer is clean, not because it's fair, because it's legal. That's stage 4 in the modern era, making ownership conditional through compliance. And here's why the green banner is uniquely powerful. Because it creates a moral high ground that shuts down debate. It turns policy into virtue. So instead of asking, who benefits from this rule? And people ask, are you a good person? That's the trap. Because the mechanism doesn't care about virtue. It cares about control and collateral. Let's talk about who gets hit first. It's not the ultra-wealthy, not at the beginning. Not because the ultra-wealthy are saints, because they're mobile. They can restructure, they can move capital, they can buy compliance, they can hire experts, they can arbitrage jurisdictions. The easiest targets are the ones with visible assets stuck in place. A house on a deed, a car with a title, a paycheck through payroll, a savings account inside a regulated bank, a small business with permits. The middle class is the easiest to pressure because the middle class is the most documented. You can't hide a house. You can't move a neighborhood. So the squeeze is applied where the spreadsheet can reach. And the green transition inside a debt-heavy system becomes a sorting machine. If you can afford upgrades, you stay. If you can't, you bleed. And when people bleed, they sell. And when forced selling happens at scale, who buys? The entities with cheaper capital, longer horizons, and teams that specialize in compliance. Institutional buyers, large landlords. Consolidators, the people who don't fear paperwork because paperwork is their weapon. This is how the transfer happens without anyone calling it a transfer. Now let me say something clearly, so nobody twists this. This is not a morality lecture about whether clean air matters. This is not a debate about whether sustainability is good. You can support environmental goals and still recognize a financial mechanism that can be abused. You can want cleaner systems and still reject turning ownership into a conditional license. Because once the infrastructure exists, intent stops mattering. Control matters, and infrastructure never shrinks. Databases don't get deleted, standards don't relax, penalties don't disappear, they ratchet. That's the one-way door. So ask yourself a hard question. If the next crisis hits, energy shock, recession, debt spiral, war, bank stress, do you think the system will say, no, we'll pause enforcement because people are struggling? Or will it say, that's exactly why enforcement is necessary? Because that is how stage 4 always gets sold, as necessity, as stability, as safety. And the more urgent the banner sounds, the faster the public accepts restrictions. Here's the part that should scare you, not as drama, as math. When systems are overloaded with liabilities, they need collateral. They need assets that can be tapped. And the green compliance framework turns everyday assets into tappable levers. Your home becomes a policy object. Your car becomes a policy object. Your business becomes a policy object. Even your savings can become a policy object through what's considered responsible allocation. That's the end game, not a raid, a reclassification. Now, let's talk about the psychological trick that keeps people asleep. People think confiscation must be violent to be real. They imagine a cartoon villain. They imagine obvious tyranny. But modern confiscation is boring on purpose. It's designed to feel like adulthood, like administration, like common sense. And by the time the average person realizes what's happening, the pipeline is already built. They're not fighting a policy. They're fighting an ecosystem. That's why reversal is rare. Because once systems integrate, the integration becomes normal. And normal is the hardest thing to kill. Now the question becomes, what do? Not panic, not fantasy, not rage posting. You get practical, like an adult in a world that plays hardball. First, stop building your life on fragile assumptions. If your stability depends on permanently cheap debt, permanently low energy costs, and permanently light regulation, you're living on a promise someone else controls. Start designing your finances like costs can rise and rules can tighten, because they can. Second, map your enforcement pathways. Most people can't name the 5 institutions that can financially cripple them without seizing anything. Tax authority, insurance company, mortgage lender, utility provider, municipal code enforcement. If you don't know who can pressure your assets, you don't own them in the way you think you do. You're not free. You're simply not audited yet. Third, build optionality. Optionality is the antidote to conditional ownership. Optionality means choices. Choices of location, choices of income, choices of how fast you can pivot. Confiscation targets immobility. So optionality looks like lowering debt, diversifying income, keeping emergency liquidity, maintaining transferable skills, and avoiding single points of failure. Fourth, treat compliance as a financial variable, not as a moral identity. This is where people get trapped. They think, if I'm a good person, I'll be safe. No. Compliance status affects liquidity. Liquidity affects pricing. Pricing determines who owns what 5 years from now. If your home becomes hard to insure, it becomes hard to keep. If your home becomes hard to finance, it becomes hard to sell. If your asset gets labeled substandard, it gets discounted, and discounted assets get acquired. That's not ideology, that's market gravity. Now, let me give you a warning that feels uncomfortable because it's true. Most people reject the pattern right before it hits them. They say, that could never happen here. They said it in Weimar. They said it in 1933. They said it before bank resolution frameworks. They say it every time because admitting it would force action. And action is uncomfortable. So the mind picks denial, and denial is expensive. Here's the real question you should be asking. Not, will we become a dictatorship? That's a distraction. The real question is, will the administrative machine keep expanding quietly until your ownership is conditional, while you're still calling it normal? Because that's the modern model. A letter, a deadline, a rating, a penalty, a restriction, a lien. And by the time it feels like seizure, the system can shrug and say, you had options. That's the nastiest part. It makes the victim feel guilty. It turns pressure into personal responsibility. And if you think that can't happen, look at the direction of every major system over the last 20 years. More reporting, more integration, more compliance, more enforcement capacity. Less privacy, less cash freedom, more dependency. That's the slope. So let me lock this in with a simple summary, the way a system planner would say it behind closed doors. If you want to transfer assets without revolt, you don't take, you reclassify, you don't ban, you price people out, you don't announce seizure, you engineer non-compliance, you don't chase the rich, you harvest the fixed and documented. And you wrap it in a moral banner so resistance looks selfish. That's the machine. Now, here's where the story gets even darker, and this is the cliffhanger most people miss. Once the pipeline exists, it doesn't need a green excuse forever. It becomes a general purpose control tool. Today, it's emissions. Tomorrow, it can be safety, then equity, then stability, then national security. Same infrastructure. New justification. That's why the real fight isn't over one policy. It's over whether conditional ownership becomes the default framework of society. Because once ownership is conditional, you don't have citizens. You have tenants of the system. So here's what I want from you. Because this is where the conversation gets real. Do you think this plays out more through housing first or through vehicles first? And what's the first compliance squeeze you've personally noticed where you live? Insurance, taxes, inspections, financing, utilities? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them and it tells me where the pressure points are hitting fastest. And if you want the next breakdown, I'll map the choke points, where enforcement usually attaches first, which assets get squeezed hardest, and how people quietly get forced into selling before they realize the trap is closed. Subscribe, because this is moving faster than people think. And the ones who spot the machine early are the ones who keep their options when everyone else gets boxed in.